The words hit Elsie Sawyer like a fist to the chest before she even pushed through the saloon doors. She had been standing just outside on the weathered boardwalk of Caldwell, Kansas, her hand pressed flat against the rough timber of the exterior wall, catching her breath after the long walk from the dry goods store. The afternoon sun in June of 1879 was merciless, hammering down on the dusty Main Street with the kind of heat that made the air shimmer and buckle. She had not intended to listen. She had not intended to stop at all. But the voice from inside carried through the gap in the batwing doors with the effortless cruelty of a man who had never once in his life worried about being overheard. That Sawyer woman. Oh, I know exactly what she is. Drifted into town with nothing but a lying tongue and a borrowed wagon. You ask anybody in Abilene, they will tell you. They will tell you what kind of woman sets up a boarding house alone and takes in strangers at night without a husband to account for her. She is no better than the girls working the back rooms of this very establishment, and I would wager she is considerably worse, because at least those girls are honest about their trade. Laughter. A whole room of laughter, low and rolling, the kind that coats itself in whiskey and settles into the walls of a place like rot. Elsie did not move. Her fingers curled slowly against the wooden wall, and she pressed her thumbnail into the grain of it until the splinter bit into her skin. She knew that voice. It belonged to Warren Holt, land speculator, self-appointed moral authority of Caldwell, and the man who had spent the last 3 weeks attempting to purchase the small lot she had legally obtained on the eastern edge of town where she planned to build her boarding house. She had refused him twice. This was apparently his answer. She had been through this before. In Abilene, when the banker's wife had started the rumor that she was a woman of loose character because she had been seen speaking to a trail hand at dusk. In Wichita before that, where a single woman trying to conduct business without a male intermediary was treated as a kind of civic abnormality, something to be corrected or removed. She had learned, slowly and at great personal cost, that defending herself out loud only gave the rumors more air to breathe. So she stood and she absorbed it the way a fence post absorbs rain, standing straight while the water soaks into its wood and slowly splits it from the inside. She was 30 years old. She had survived a great deal of splitting. She was already beginning to pull her hand from the wall, already composing herself to walk away when she heard the second voice, and everything changed. It was not loud. That was the first thing she noticed about it. It did not rise to compete with the room. It did not bray or posture. It simply landed, quiet and absolute, with the particular gravity of a man who has learned that stillness commands more fear than volume. "You will want to stop talking now, Warren." The laughter died. Not gradually, not one man at a time, but all at once, the way a candle flame dies when a hand cups around it. "I beg your pardon." Holt's voice, higher now, stripped of its audience warmth. "Miss Sawyer obtained that lot through Dawson's land office with a clear deed and 2 witness signatures. She paid the full asking price in legal tender. I know this because I was present in that office when the transaction was recorded. I know her name on that deed to be Elsie Ruth Sawyer, and that name is attached to legitimate property in this county, which makes her a landowner and a taxpayer, and a citizen of this community in better standing than a man who has twice attempted to acquire property through coercion." A pause, and in that pause the entire saloon seemed to forget how to breathe. "I also know that what you just said about her character is a lie designed to damage a woman who has done nothing but refuse to sell you something that is not yours. I will not sit in the same room with that lie and say nothing. You will not speak of her that way again. Not in this town." Elsie's hand had gone completely still against the wall. Her heart was doing something strange and irregular inside her chest, something that felt like it was relearning a rhythm it had forgotten it knew. She did not know that voice. She did not know the man attached to it. She had never in her life heard those particular words spoken on her behalf in any saloon, in any town, by anyone. She stood on that boardwalk in the white blaze of the Kansas afternoon and felt something in her that had been clenched for years, without her even being fully aware of how tightly it had been clenched, begin to loosen the smallest, most terrifying degree. She did not go inside. She was not ready to see the face of a man who had just done something that no one had ever done for her before. She walked away instead, very slowly, as if the ground beneath her boots had become uncertain, and she carried those words with her like something fragile and breakable that she did not yet know what to do with. She would learn the name Alfred Crawford before nightfall, and she would spend the next 4 months discovering what it cost a person to let themselves believe, again, that they might be worth defending. Elsie had come to Caldwell because it was the end of a cattle trail, which meant it was the beginning of everything else. The Kishom Trail had been pushing cattle north from Texas since the late 1860s, and by 1879, Caldwell was positioning itself as the new queen of the Kansas cattle towns, hungry and ambitious, and full of the particular madness that comes when enormous sums of money change hands in a short season. Cowboys arrived exhausted and flush, ranchers arrived calculating, and merchants of every stripe arrived hoping to catch the current before it moved elsewhere. Elsie arrived because she needed to put down roots somewhere before she forgot entirely how. She had grown up in Ohio, the daughter of a schoolteacher father and a mother who died when Elsie was 11, leaving her with the habit of reading everything she could find and the permanent internal posture of someone waiting for the next loss to arrive. Her father had died in 1871, the year she turned 22, and she had spent the years between then and now moving steadily westward in a pattern she had not initially recognized as escape, but had eventually come to understand was exactly that. She had worked as a seamstress in Cincinnati, a cook in St. Louis, a schoolteacher herself in a small Missouri town where she had lasted 2 years before the school board decided, with enormous regret, that a young unmarried woman with opinions was a liability to the education of impressionable children. She had tried Abilene, she had tried Wichita, and now she was here in Caldwell with $230 in savings, a legal deed to a lot measuring 60 feet by 120 feet on the eastern edge of Kishom Street, and a plan that was either practical or desperate depending on how you looked at it. The plan was a boarding house. Clean rooms, decent meals, reasonable rates for trail hands and traveling merchants who wanted a bed that did not involve the risk of being robbed in the night. There was a genuine demand for it. Caldwell's population was swelling faster than its housing, and the existing hotels were either full, expensive, or disreputable in ways that discouraged the more cautious sort of traveler. Elsie had done the calculations. She had spoken to the lumber merchants. She had a contractor named Gibson who was willing to begin framing in July if she could secure the remaining funds through a construction loan from the Caldwell Bank, whose manager, a cautious and perpetually suspicious man named Beaumont, had been reviewing her application for 2 weeks. Warren Holt's intervention in that saloon had not been accidental. She understood that now, in the days that followed. He had known she was up for the loan. He had known that her character, as a single woman in a cattle town, was the most vulnerable point in her application. A few well-placed words in the right ears, an insinuation dropped into the social soil of the town like a seed, and Beaumont's caution would have an excuse to become refusal. It was a neat trap. It was also, she thought with a cold, specific anger, exactly the kind of trap that worked because it had worked so many times before, in so many other towns, on so many other women who had made the mistake of trying to own something. She had gone to Beaumont's bank the morning after the saloon incident, braced for the refusal, already beginning in her mind the exhausting inventory of alternatives. She had put on her best dress, a dark blue cotton with white collar, pressed that morning with a flat iron heated on the small stove in her rented room. She had gathered her documentation, her deed, her savings receipts, her letter of intent, her projected income figures written in her clear schoolteacher's hand. She had walked in and sat down across from Beaumont's desk and waited for the axe. Instead, Beaumont had asked her a few procedural questions, reviewed her papers with his customary expression of pained deliberation, and told her that he would have a decision within the week. He had not refused her. He had not even seemed particularly hostile. He had seemed, if anything, slightly awkward, as if he were trying to behave naturally in a situation where someone had recently altered the conditions without his full understanding. She learned later, from the postmistress Mrs. Hartley, who knew everything that moved through Caldwell because everything moved through the post office eventually, that Alfred Crawford had been in to see Beaumont the previous afternoon, that he had not asked for anything specific, had not applied any explicit pressure, had simply had a conversation about the importance of legitimate business investment to the town's development, about the value of reliable, respectable enterprises during a period of rapid growth, about how the kind of stability that a well-run boarding house represented was exactly what distinguished a town with a future from a transient camp that would dry up when the cattle money moved elsewhere. He had not mentioned Elsie by name, apparently. He had not needed to. The timing had done that work on its own. She did not know yet whether to be grateful or furious. She was, in fact, both, which was a complicated combination to carry while trying to decide how to feel about a man she had never actually met. She met him on a Thursday, 6 days after the saloon incident, in the improbable setting of the dry goods store, owned by a German immigrant named Gruber, who stocked everything from flour and salt pork to calico fabric and lamp oil, with the cheerful commercial efficiency of a man who believed deeply that scarcity was a personal failing. Elsie was pricing lumber nails, which she needed to understand in detail because Gibson had given her an estimate that she suspected was padded, and she was making notes in the small notebook she carried everywhere, when she became aware that someone at the end of the counter was watching her. Not the idle, evaluating look that men in cattle towns often directed at women, but something more focused, more genuinely curious, as if she were a problem that interested him. She looked up and found a man of perhaps 34 or 35, tall and lean the way working men in this country were lean, with the kind of tan that came from years of outdoor labor rather than weeks of it. He had dark brown hair touched at the temples with the first suggestions of gray, and eyes that were a particular shade of light hazel that she would later describe to herself, privately, as the color of the Kansas prairie in autumn, not romantic so much as accurate. His clothing was clean but plainly functional, the clothes of a man who had money but no particular interest in demonstrating it through fabric. He was holding a piece of paper that appeared to be a supply list, and he had clearly been waiting for Gruber's attention for some time, but his attention was entirely on her. "You are Elsie Sawyer," he said. Not a question, not an intrusion somehow, despite being both those things. "I am," she said, keeping her voice even, making no assumptions about what was coming next. "I am Alfred Crawford. I ranch about 12 miles southeast of town." He paused. "I owe you an apology." Of all the things she had prepared herself to hear, that was not one of them. "I beg your pardon," she said, and heard with a small internal shock that she was using the same phrase Warren Holt had used in an entirely different register. "I spoke in the saloon last week about the comments Holt made. I spoke without your knowledge or your permission, and I made decisions on your behalf, specifically the conversation with Beaumont, that were not mine to make. You are conducting your business affairs independently, by design and by right, and I had no authority to intervene in them, regardless of my intentions. I am sorry for the presumptuousness of it." Elsie set down her pencil very carefully on the counter surface and looked at this man. In 30 years of life, across Ohio, Missouri, Kansas, and the intermediate territory of everywhere she had been in between, she had never once had a man apologize to her for trying to help her. She had been patronized. She had been managed. She had been spoken for, spoken over, and spoken around. She had been helped by men who then expected gratitude so comprehensive it resembled debt. She had been occasionally defended, though rarely, And when she had been, the defense had come wrapped in the assumption that she needed it, that she was incapable of managing without it, and that the defender was therefore owed something in return. This man was apologizing, with specificity, acknowledging not just the possibility that he had overstepped, but the exact mechanism by which he had overstepped, which suggested he had actually thought carefully about it afterward. "Did it work?" she asked. The conversation with Beaumont, something flickered in his hazel eyes. "I believe so." He seemed receptive. "Then I cannot be entirely angry," she said. "Though I will note that I was in the process of handling it myself. I have no doubt of that." He said it without qualification, without the slight softening edge of false courtesy that she had learned to recognize as the sound of a man saying something he did not entirely believe. "You were there," she said, "in the land office when I purchased the lot." "Yes." "Why?" "I had business there myself. I purchased an additional grazing parcel adjacent to my eastern pasture the same week." He paused. "I saw your name on the deed. I remembered it when Holt started talking." She picked up her pencil again. "Why did you remember it?" He was quiet for a moment, and in that moment she heard something in the quality of his silence that was different from the comfortable silences of men who simply had nothing to say. This was a thinking silence, a careful one. "Because you were alone," he said finally, "and the clerk was being unpleasant to you, and you handled it with more dignity than he deserved, and it stayed with me. I do not know why things stay with me. They simply do." Gruber appeared at that moment from the back of the store, wiping his hands on his apron and offering his broad, indiscriminate smile, and the conversation shifted into the practical. But Elsie carried it with her when she left, folded it carefully into the part of herself where she kept the things she was not yet ready to examine directly. The loan came through the following Tuesday, $40 short of what she had requested, which was Beaumont's way of protecting himself while still extending credit, but workable. Gibson began framing the first week of July, and Elsie threw herself into the construction with an energy that surprised even herself, because it turned out that watching something she had planned and financed and fought for rise up out of raw lumber and nails on a piece of ground that legally belonged to her was one of the most profoundly satisfying experiences of her adult life. She saw Alfred Crawford occasionally during that first month. Caldwell was not a large town. He came in for supplies, for ranch business, for the various transactions that bound a working operation to the commercial center of its territory. They spoke when they encountered each other, which happened often enough that she began to notice when it did not happen, which alarmed her, because noticing the absence of something was how you began to depend on it. She learned things about him in pieces, the way you learn things about a country by traveling through it. She learned that he had built his ranch, the Crawford Range, over 7 years from a modest original parcel purchased in 1872 with money earned on 3 cattle drives north from Texas, where he had worked as a trail hand in his late 20s. She learned that he had grown up in Tennessee, the second son of a family that had lost everything in the war and rebuilt slowly and imperfectly, which explained, she thought, something about the quality of his attention, the particular care of a man who understood what things cost to build and what it felt like to have them taken apart. She learned that he was unmarried, had been engaged once, to a woman in Wichita who had ultimately decided that a ranch 12 miles outside of town was too far from the life she wanted, a decision he spoke of without bitterness, which was itself a kind of character evidence. She learned that he was good at his work. The cowboys who worked for him, she observed, spoke of him with the straightforward respect of men who were paid fairly and treated decently, which in a cattle town in 1879 was a distinction worth noting. She learned that he had a habit of reading, which surprised most people who knew him, though she was not sure why it should, and that he kept a small collection of books in his ranch house that he had carried from Tennessee, and added to whenever he found a bookseller, which was not often in this part of the world. What she was slower to learn, because she was being exceptionally careful about learning it, was that he was developing a habit of being near wherever she happened to be. Not intrusively, not in a way that crowded her or implied ownership or suggested anything she had not invited, just near, available in the way a good fence post is available, solid and reliable and there. She told herself she did not need it. She had been managing her own presence in the world without support for a very long time, and she had become proficient at it, the way you become proficient at anything you do every day for years. Proficiency was not the same as preference. She was beginning to understand the difference, and the understanding frightened her in a very specific and intimate way. The boarding house walls went up in August. The roof went on in the first week of September, which was faster than Gibson had promised and slower than Elsie had hoped for, which was about the pace of everything in her experience. She spent the evenings in her rented room going over the finish work decisions, wallpaper or whitewash, the relative merits of different window treatments in terms of light versus privacy, the calculations of furnishing 6 rooms on a budget that required her to be both practical and appealing. Alfred came by the construction site one afternoon in late August, a Sunday when Gibson's crew was not working, and stood with her in the open frame of what would become the front parlor. The light came through the unglazed window openings in long golden bars and laid itself across the raw floor boards, and Elsie watched him look at the space with the same assessing attention he gave to everything, and felt something that she recognized with a kind of weary internal honesty as warmth. "You have thought about every detail," he said. "I have had to. There is no one else to think about them." She said it without complaint, just as a fact, but something in the way she said it made him look at her directly. "Is that what you prefer?" he asked. "Or is that what has been available?" It was a more precise question than she had expected, and more uncomfortable for its precision. "Both," she said after a moment. "It started as necessity and became preference, and I am not entirely certain I can fully separate the two anymore." He was quiet, looking at the light on the floor boards. "I understand that," he said. "I have been alone a long time myself. There is a kind of freedom in it that becomes so familiar it starts to resemble something you chose, even when you did not exactly choose it." "Did you choose it?" she asked. "No," he said. "But I have not done much to undo it either." He paused. "Until fairly recently." She looked at him then. He was looking at the window, the particular quality of not quite meeting her eyes that she had come to recognize as his version of vulnerability, the way a man who is careful with words holds the difficult ones in his mouth a moment before releasing them. "Alfred," she said. "I know," he said. "I am not asking for anything. I want to be clear about that. I am not trying to be another thing you have to manage." "What are you trying to be?" He finally looked at her. "Useful," he said. "And possibly in time, if it suits you, something more than that. But only if it suits you." She turned back to the window frame and breathed the smell of raw lumber and late summer Kansas air, which smelled of dust and grass and the distant, permanent suggestion of cattle, and thought about what it would mean to let herself want something that was not just survival. Warren Holt had not gone away. She had understood he would not. Men like Holt did not lose an acquisition battle and simply redirect their energy. They redirected their strategy, which was more dangerous because it became less visible. In September, he appeared before the town's newly formed business council, a body of 7 men who had constituted themselves as a sort of informal civic authority, and proposed a set of licensing requirements for boarding establishments that were, on their face, entirely reasonable, and were, in their construction, precisely calibrated to create obstacles for a single woman operating without a male guarantor. The proposal required that any boarding establishment serving unaccompanied men must have a licensed proprietor who had resided in Caldwell for a minimum of 2 years, or alternatively must have a co-proprietor or guarantor resident of equivalent standing. Elsie had been in Caldwell for 5 months. She had no co-proprietor. The proposal was, in other words, a trap built specifically to the dimensions of her situation. She prepared her response carefully over 3 days, sitting at the small table in her rented room with her lantern burning past midnight, writing and rewriting. She researched what county records she could access. She noted that no similar licensing had been applied to the two existing hotels in town, both of which were operated by men who had arrived in Caldwell within the previous 18 months. She prepared a formal objection on the grounds of selective application and presented it to the council in a session that was, she had been told by Mrs. Hartley, very well attended by the town's male citizenry, few of whom had any particular stake in the matter but all of whom found it entertaining. She presented her case clearly and calmly, and with the precise documentation that was the only weapon available to her. The council listened with the particular patience of men who had already made up their minds, but felt obligated to perform deliberation. Alfred Crawford was not on the council. He was, however, in the room, which she had not known until she looked up during the formal question period, and found him standing at the back wall with his arms folded and his eyes on the council chairman, a man named Prescott, with an expression that she had learned to identify as his version of controlled intensity. When the formal presentation ended, and Prescott began the procedural movement toward a vote, Alfred spoke from the back of the room. "Point of order," he said, and the room went quiet in the way rooms did when he spoke. Prescott blinked. "Mr. Crawford, the proposed ordinance cites a concern for public safety and moral order in establishments serving unaccompanied male travelers. I would like to ask the council to identify, specifically, what incident or pattern of incidents at Miss Sawyer's establishment has generated this concern." "There has been no specific incident," Prescott said carefully. "This is a preventive measure." "Against what specifically?" "Against the potential for, well, against circumstances that can arise when the proprietorial oversight of a mixed-occupancy establishment lacks the appropriate, that is to say, without the proper structure of authority that, in our community standards, is generally represented by, well." Prescott trailed off. "By a man," Alfred said with perfect quiet neutrality. "By an appropriate guarantor," Prescott said, recovering. "The ordinance as written would not apply to Samuel Bates at the Grand Hotel, who arrived in Caldwell in March of this year and operates without a co-proprietor, or to James Whitfield's commercial lodging on 2nd Street, who has been here approximately 14 months. If the concern is genuinely about public safety and the length of establishment in the community, I would expect those businesses to face identical requirements. If the council is not prepared to apply this standard equally, then what is being proposed here is not a safety ordinance. It is a targeted restriction aimed at one specific individual, which is not within the proper authority of this council, and which exposes its members to potential legal challenge under territorial statutes governing equal commerce." He paused. "I have spoken to the county attorney. He agrees with my reading of the statute." The room had gone very still. Elsie was watching Prescott's face, which was doing several complicated things at once. Alfred was not finished. "Miss Sawyer is a property-owning taxpayer of this town, in better financial standing than a significant number of the men in this room, with a legal right to conduct her business without selective interference dressed up as civic concern. I would suggest the council table this proposal indefinitely and direct its attention toward questions that actually affect the public welfare of Caldwell." The vote to table was 5-2. Warren Holt, who was not on the council but was sitting in the front row, left the room without speaking and without looking at either Alfred or Elsie, which she recognized as the specific retreat of a man who was not giving up but was recalculating. After the room cleared, she found Alfred in the corridor outside, standing with his hat in his hands. "You did that yourself," he said before she could speak. "Your presentation was clear, documented, and correct. I only gave the council the legal cover to do the right thing without feeling coerced by public pressure. You researched the territorial statute," she said. "I had time. You spoke to the county attorney. I know him from a property dispute in '77. He was happy to discuss it. She looked at him for a long moment. The oil lamp in the corridor cast warm light across his face, and she could see the slight tension in his jaw that told her the ease of his demeanor cost him something, that behind the careful calm he was waiting for something too. "Alfred," she said. "Elsie." "Why?" The word came out softer than she intended, carrying more of what she meant by it than she had planned to reveal. He was quiet for long enough that she heard the sounds of men dispersing on the street outside, the creak of the building settling in the night air. Then he said, "Because what is being done to you is wrong. Because you are someone who deserves to be in this town and to build what you are building and to be left alone to do it with dignity. And because somewhere in the last 3 months I have stopped being able to imagine Caldwell without you in it. And that has given me a very selfish motive alongside the principled one, which I think it is only honest to disclose." She breathed. The lantern flickered. "That is a great deal to say in a corridor," she said. "I have been holding it for some time." "I know," she said. "I have been watching you hold it." He looked at her then with an expression she had not seen on his face before, unguarded in a way his face rarely was, open the way a room is open when all the windows are thrown wide at once, and she felt something in her chest respond to it with a force that was almost frightening, the way physical sensation can be frightening when you have been numb in a particular place for a long time and the feeling returns all at once. "I would like to call on you," he said, "formally, if you will allow it." "I will consider it," she said. And then, because she had been honest with herself in small, careful increments over the last 3 months, and this felt like the moment to be honest aloud, she said, "I will almost certainly allow it." The smile that moved across his face was not the broad, easy grin of a man comfortable with his own charm. It was quieter than that. It was the smile of a man who had not been certain and was now less uncertain, and it was, she thought, one of the most affecting things she had ever seen. He called on her the following Sunday in the proper fashion, presenting himself at the door of her rented room at 2 in the afternoon, hat in hand, with a copy of a collection of essays by Ralph Waldo Emerson that he had apparently been carrying in his saddlebag since Tennessee, and which he offered as a calling gift with an air of slightly formal awkwardness that she found extraordinarily endearing. "I thought you might like it," he said, "given that you teach, or taught." "I read Emerson in Ohio," she said. "But I left all my books behind when I came west. The weight was impractical." She took the book from him. It was worn, the spine soft with handling, the pages with the faint, yellowish, warm quality of pages that have been read in lamplight over many years. "These are your annotations," she said, noting the faint pencil marks in the margins. "Yes." He seemed briefly uncertain whether the annotations were welcome. "I want to read everything you wrote," she said, and meant it in a way that extended beyond the literal. They walked through the town that afternoon, and then the Sunday after that, and the one after that, as October arrived, and the Kansas sky took on the particular aching blue of autumn that made everything appear more vivid and more temporary simultaneously. She showed him the boarding house as it progressed toward completion. He told her about the ranch, the specific challenges of managing cattle through a Kansas winter, the ongoing negotiations with the Texas drovers who would be running cattle north again in the spring. She told him about Ohio, about her father, about the books she had carried in her mind when she could not carry them in her wagon. He told her about Tennessee, about the war's aftermath as experienced by a child who was too young to fight and old enough to understand what was being lost. They discovered, incrementally and with increasing delight, that they had been reading many of the same books in very different locations for years, and that their reactions to those books were similar enough to feel like recognition and different enough to feel like discovery. She was falling in love with him. She was aware of this the way you are aware of walking toward the edge of something, your feet knowing before your mind does that the ground is about to change. She did not fight it exactly. She had passed the point where fighting it was something she was willing to spend the energy on. But she was cautious with it, carried it carefully, the way you carry something fragile in a landscape where the ground is uncertain. October brought rain and the final stages of the boarding house finish work, and also brought an unexpected complication in the form of a letter from Abilene. She recognized the return name on the envelope as belonging to a woman named Margaret Fellows, who had been the wife of the banker in Abilene during Elsie's time there, and who had, along with her husband, been among the people who had quietly but effectively contributed to the environment that had made Elsie leave. She opened the letter with a sense of careful foreboding. It was not from Margaret Fellows directly. It was forwarded through Margaret's address from a former employer in Missouri, a man named Dunleavy who had operated the boarding house where Elsie had worked as a cook before her move to Abilene, and who was apparently now engaged in a business dispute that he believed Elsie could help resolve, since she had been present for certain events he needed witnessed. The letter was procedural and legal in its language, and had nothing sinister about it on its own terms. But it had passed through Margaret Fellows' hands. 2 days later she overheard Mrs. Hartley in the post office telling someone that there was apparently a story circulating from Abilene about Elsie's time there. The story, as Mrs. Hartley summarized it with the particular delicacy of a woman who knows she is passing on something destructive, but feels that information has an obligation to move, was that Elsie had left Abilene under financial suspicion, that there had been some question about missing funds from the boarding house where she had worked, that nothing had been proven, but that nothing had needed to be because she had left. She stood in the post office and listened to her dark past being rewritten by someone she had never directly harmed, and felt the familiar, exhausting weight of being a woman whose reputation was everyone else's property. She knew where it had come from. Holt had connections in Abilene. He had clearly done the work of digging. She went home and sat at her table and thought for a long time, and then she picked up her pen and began writing to Dunleavy. She wrote to the county court record's office in Abilene, requesting a formal confirmation that no charges had ever been filed against her, no investigation opened, no proceedings of any kind commenced. She wrote to 2 former colleagues from that period who she knew had also observed her conduct to be entirely proper and who, she hoped, would be willing to say so in writing. She told Alfred about it the next Sunday, sitting across the table from him in Gruber's small eating area, over coffee that tasted primarily of proximity to the coffee sacks rather than actual coffee. He listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. "This is Holt's work," he said when she finished. "I believe so." "What do you need from me?" he asked. She looked at him. "Nothing yet. I am handling it. But I wanted you to know because you should not hear it through Mrs. Hartley and wonder whether it is something I was hiding from you. It is not something I was hiding. It is something that does not exist, and I am in the process of documenting that." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his briefly, just a moment of pressure, warm and deliberate. "I know it doesn't exist," he said. "I would not ask you to prove it. You believe me without documentation. I have known you for 3 months, Elsie. I have watched you conduct your business, manage your finances, respond to every obstacle with precision and integrity. The idea that you were involved in financial dishonesty is inconsistent with everything I have observed. More importantly, it is the exact kind of accusation that gets made against independent women who make people like Holt uncomfortable, and I have seen it happen before and I know what it looks like." He paused. "Though I understand why you need the documentation, not for me, for the town. For my loan," she said. "If Beaumont hears this before I can counter it, he may call the note." "I will speak to Beaumont," he said, and then, before she could respond, "with your permission this time. To tell him that I know the accusation to be without foundation, and that I will personally guarantee your note if he feels he needs additional security." "Alfred, that is a significant financial commitment to make on behalf of someone you have known for 3 months. "It is," he agreed. "I am aware of that. Would you like me to not make it?" She looked at him for a long time, this careful, steady man who had been finding ways to put himself between her and the forces that wanted her small, not with the presumption of ownership but with the simplest possible expression of faith. "Speak to Beaumont," she said. "Thank you." He nodded once. the economy of movement that she had come to read as the equivalent of a longer speech in a person less measured. The documentation arrived from Abilene in 3 weeks. Clean records, letters from 2 former colleagues, a formal county court confirmation that no proceedings of any kind had ever been commenced against Elsie Ruth Sawyer in Dickinson County, Kansas. She presented it to Beaumont, who accepted it with visible relief, as a man who had been nervous and now had grounds to stop being nervous. Warren Holt made one more attempt. In November, a week before the boarding house was scheduled to open, he appeared at the construction site with 2 men she did not know, older men with the look of money about them, and made her a formal offer to purchase the property outright. The offer was fair by market standards, perhaps slightly above. He presented it with the surface warmth of a man who has decided to be generous, which was the most alarming version of him she had encountered. "I am not selling," she said. "Miss Sawyer, I want you to understand that this offer represents a genuine appreciation for what you have accomplished here. I have perhaps not been, that is to say, we have perhaps gotten off to an unfortunate start, and I would like to suggest that this offer represents a clean conclusion to that misunderstanding." "There was no misunderstanding," she said. "You attempted to prevent me from doing business in this town because I declined to sell you my property, and when that failed, you attempted to damage my reputation and manufacture false accusations. Those were not misunderstandings. I do not accept the offer, and I would suggest that you consider your relationship with this property concluded, because I have no intention of selling, now or in the future. This boarding house is going to open next week, and it is going to operate successfully, and in 5 years it is going to be the best-run establishment on this street. Good afternoon, Mr. Holt." She held his gaze for the 3 seconds it took for him to understand that she meant it, every word, and then she turned back to her work. She heard him leave. She heard the scrape of boot heels on the fresh lumber of her front steps, and the creak of the new door, and then the sound of retreating footsteps on the dry November street, and she pressed her hands flat against the wall she was preparing to paint and breathed deeply and evenly until the shaking in her fingers stopped. Then she picked up her brush and continued. The boarding house opened on the 15th of November, 1879, on a day that was cold and bright and smelled of wood shavings and fresh whitewash, and the cedar blocks she had placed in each linen drawer to discourage moths. She had 6 rooms, each furnished simply and cleanly, with good mattresses and real pillows and hooks on the door for hanging clothes. The parlor downstairs had a settee and 2 armchairs and a reading table with an oil lamp, and the dining room was set for 12, which was more seats than she currently had guests to fill, but she had planned for growth. Alfred came that evening, after the first 3 guests had checked in. He stood in the front parlor with his hat in his hands and looked around the room that had been a frame of raw lumber the first time he stood in it, and she watched him take in what it had become, and felt a private, complicated pride in that, in showing him this. "It is exactly right," he said. "You are not supposed to be here in the evening," she said, because proper form required a chaperone for evening calls and they both knew it. "Mrs. Hartley will have something to say." "Mrs. Hartley will forgive the irregularity given the occasion," he said. "And I brought a chaperone." He stepped aside and Mrs. Hartley herself appeared in the doorway, having apparently been waiting in the corridor with the satisfied expression of someone who had arranged things. Elsie laughed, fully and freely, in a way she had not laughed in longer than she could easily remember. Alfred looked at her when she laughed, with that expression she had come to know as his version of happiness, the unguarded kind, and she felt it answer something in her chest. They had dinner, the 3 of them, at the dining-room table, and it was the first meal served in the Sawyer boarding house, and Elsie thought, privately and with her whole heart, that it was the best dinner she had ever eaten, because of what it represented, and because of who was at the table, and because it was November in Caldwell, Kansas, and for the first time in years she was somewhere she intended to stay. Alfred drove Mrs. Hartley home in his wagon at 9 o'clock and came back briefly to say good night, standing on the front steps, the cold air sharp and still, the stars overhead in that particular density that only happened in the open country, away from the concentrated coal smoke of eastern cities. "Elsie," he said. "Alfred, I need to tell you something." He turned his hat brim through his hands slowly, in the way she had learned meant he was about to say something important and was taking care with how he said it. "I think I have been in love with you since the afternoon you were pricing nails in Gruber's store, and you told me you could not be entirely angry at me, which was the most gracious possible response to someone who had acted without your authority, and I have been trying since then to be someone who deserves the kind of woman who would say a thing like that." He stopped. "I am not certain I have succeeded, but I wanted you to know where I have been trying to get to." The cold pressed in from the dark, and the stars burned overhead with their impartial, ageless light, and Elsie looked at this man who had stood up in a room full of people, and said her name as though it was something worth saying, who had researched county statutes on her behalf, who had apologized for helping her, and then helped her again and apologized for none of the subsequent times, who had said "I believe you" without asking for proof, who had brought her a book worn soft with his own reading and offered it as though it were something precious. "I think," she said carefully, "that you have more than succeeded. And I think I have been in love with you since you stood at the back of that council meeting and said my name was attached to legitimate property in this county, in a tone that made every man in the room understand that it was not a negotiable position." She paused. "Though I have been fighting it for some time because I have not had very good luck with trusting things." "I know," he said. "I know you have not. I intend to be worth the risk of trusting." "I believe you," she said. "That is what is remarkable about it. I actually believe you." He reached out and took her hand, gently, the way you take hold of something you intend to keep, and she let him, and the dark and cold of the Kansas November wrapped around them both and felt, improbably, like shelter. He proposed formally in December, on a Sunday afternoon, at the boarding house in the parlor, with Mrs. Hartley nominally present in the adjacent room doing needlework with the particular aggressive concentration of a woman who is deliberately not listening. He had brought a ring that had been his mother's, a small gold band with a garnet setting, carried from Tennessee through 10 years of cattle drives and prairie winters in a small leather pouch at the bottom of his saddlebag. He told her this when he gave it to her, not as a reason she should accept it, but as context, as the history of a thing that had waited to be placed in the right hands. She said yes without hesitation, which surprised her, because she had expected to feel the old flinching, the deep internal recoil from commitment that had been her emotional reflex for so long. Instead, she felt clarity, the particular clean certainty of a decision that has been made by all of you at once, with no dissenting parts left behind. They were married in February of 1880, on a day when the Kansas prairie was flat and white under a thin layer of snow, and the sky was the pale blue of a morning cold pressing itself toward warmth. The ceremony was in the small Methodist church on 2nd Street, performed by the minister, Reverend Coles, in the presence of Mrs. Hartley and Gibson, the contractor, and Gruber from the dry goods store, and 6 of Alfred's ranch hands, and 2 of Elsie's boarding house guests who had extended their stays and had, over the preceding months, become something resembling friends. Warren Holt was not present. He had, in the weeks following the failure of his final offer, redirected his land speculation interests toward a parcel on the western edge of town that had nothing to do with Elsie, and while she did not expect their relationship to become cordial, she was prepared to consider it concluded. Some things resolved themselves not through confrontation, but through the simple, steady reality of someone refusing to be moved. Elsie wore her blue dress, newly made over with a white collar of fine cotton that Mrs. Hartley had pressed that morning. She carried a small bunch of hothouse flowers that Alfred had somehow, through an elaborate series of transactions that she never fully understood, managed to procure from a Kansas City flower merchant via the railroad, which had arrived in Caldwell the previous year. They were slightly wilted from the journey, but they were real, and she held them and looked across the small church at the man waiting for her, and thought that she had traveled a very long way, in every sense of the phrase, to arrive at this particular moment. Alfred's face when he saw her coming toward him was, she thought, something she would carry with her for the rest of her life. Open, utterly unguarded, lit from some internal source that had nothing to do with the thin winter light coming through the church windows. He looked at her as if she were the resolution of something he had been working on for years without knowing what the answer was. She took his hand at the altar, and it steadied her, and she understood that it would go on steadying her, not because she was incapable of standing on her own. She was entirely capable of that. She had proven it in every town she had ever been in, but because choosing to let someone steady you when you did not need to was a different kind of strength, and she was finally ready to use it. The winter passed at the ranch, where she settled into the life of a property 12 miles from town, with the same methodical attentiveness she brought to everything else. She kept the boarding house in operation, managed by a woman named Clara Whitfield, a widow of 38 with excellent practical sense and a firm but fair manner with the guests, who reported to Elsie on Thursdays when Alfred came to town for supplies. Elsie made the larger decisions and handled the accounts and came to town 2 or 3 times a week for business, driving herself in a light wagon with the horse, a steady gray mare named Constance, that Alfred had given her as a wedding gift. She had expected the ranch to be a place she lived in addition to her own life. She discovered instead that it was part of her life in ways she had not anticipated. The scale of the land, 1,200 acres of Kansas prairie that rolled away in every direction under enormous skies, affected her in a way that the contained spaces of town life never quite had. She began to understand, gradually, the rhythms of cattle ranching, the cycle of seasons and tasks, and the particular arithmetic of land and livestock. And she found that her mind, which had always moved quickly and analytically, was well suited to understanding it. Alfred taught her things she asked to know and offered opinions on things she did not ask about only when she invited them, which was, she thought, the most respectful possible way to share a life with someone. He learned her habits in return with the careful attention of a man who had always been observant, and who found that observing her was one of the more rewarding things he did with his attention. He learned that she needed mornings for her own thinking, that she was most herself in the hour after breakfast before the day's demands arrived, and he learned to give her that morning space as freely as he would have given it to himself. They argued, as people who both had opinions and were comfortable expressing them inevitably did. About ranch finances, twice, with some heat, because she had perspectives on the account books that he had not considered, and he had information about local land values that she had not fully factored into her projections. About the construction of a new hay barn, where her design suggested modifications to the framing that his contractor initially resisted, but that the carpenter ultimately acknowledged were structurally better. About whether to take on additional cattle from a Texas drover in March 1880, when the market price was favorable but the winter pasture carrying capacity was marginal, an argument she thought she lost, and he thought he lost, and in which they ultimately arrived at a number that was neither of their original figures and performed better than either figure probably would have. They were good at arguing, which is to say they argued about the subject at hand rather than the accumulated freight of older injuries, which she had come to understand was the particular gift of two people who had both spent time alone and had therefore learned not to store grievances. The spring of 1880 brought the cattle drives north again. Alfred's ranch became a provisioning stop on the eastern branch of the route, and for 6 weeks in April and May, the place was busy with the movement of longhorns and the men who drove them, dusty and tired and trail-hardened, men who treated Elsie with the matter-of-fact respect afforded to a rancher's wife who clearly knew what she was doing, which was different from and considerably easier than the conditional respect of town life for a woman on her own. In June, she told Alfred she was pregnant. She sat with him at the kitchen table after supper, the June evening pressing warm and long through the windows, and said the words plainly, without preamble, because she had learned that he preferred plainness, and because the enormity of the news needed plain words, or it would collapse under the weight of decorative ones. He sat very still for a moment. Then he reached across the table and took both her hands in both of his and pressed them, and looked at her with an expression that was entirely beyond his usual careful containment. It was just joy, unmediated, large enough to fill the kitchen and press out through the windows into the June evening. "Are you well?" he asked. The first thing he asked. "I am well," she said, "mildly inconvenienced in the mornings, otherwise entirely well." He brought her hands to his mouth and pressed his lips to her knuckles, a gesture that was not characteristic of him and which therefore, because of its uncharacteristic nature, said more than 100 characteristic gestures would have. "I will write to the doctor in town," he said, "Dr. Prentice." "I have already sent him a note," she said. "He will come next Thursday." He looked at her, and there it was again, the thing she had seen in the church and before that in the post office and before that in Gruber's store, this man looking at her as though she were something continually worth looking at. "Of course you have," he said. "I have been managing my affairs for some time," she said, and now she was smiling, because the sentence that had once been a statement of lonely independence had become, in this context, a kind of intimate shared joke, a reference to a history they had made together by beginning as two people who each managed their own affairs and choosing, deliberately, to make some of those affairs shared. The baby was born in February of 1881, on a day that rhymed, in its pale blue cold and thin winter light, with their wedding day a year previous, and he was a boy with Alfred's dark hair and Elsie's gray eyes, and a pair of lungs that expressed opinions about the world with considerable volume and specificity. They named him Robert Thomas Crawford, Thomas for Alfred's father, who had carried the weight of a Tennessee childhood through a war, and rebuilt it into something stubborn and enduring that Alfred had inherited without fully knowing it until lately, and Robert for no one in particular except that it was a solid, clean name that would hold whatever the boy grew into. Holding her son for the first time, in the soft weak February light with the prairie around them white and still, Elsie felt something complete in a way that she had previously associated with finished things, projects accomplished, buildings built, accounts settled, and was surprised to discover that it felt instead like opening, like the beginning of something larger. "He is exactly himself already," Alfred said, looking at the baby with the same quality of focused attention he brought to everything, and which, in this application, struck Elsie as the greatest gift a parent could bring to a new person. "Yes," she said, "he seems quite certain about it." The boarding house continued to prosper through 1881 and into 1882. Caldwell had officially become the primary cattle shipping point on the southern Kansas border, following the arrival of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe line extension, and the town was growing with a kind of organized energy that felt different from the wild swelling of the early cattle towns like Abilene and Dodge City. There was civic ambition in Caldwell by 1882, a school, a town charter, a newspaper called the Caldwell Commercial that reported on local business with reasonable accuracy, a sense that this was a place intended to last. The Sawyer boarding house, which Elsie had kept in her own name as a matter of principle that Alfred had never questioned, was consistently full through the busy season and comfortably occupied through the winter. Clara Whitfield had proven to be an excellent manager, and had, over the 2 years of their association, become one of Elsie's genuine friends, the kind of friendship built on mutual respect between two women who had each figured out how to survive on their own terms and were the better for having found each other. Warren Holt departed Caldwell in the spring of 1882, which Mrs. Hartley reported with the particular satisfaction of a woman who had seen a great many things come and go, and had strong opinions about which departures were improvements. He had apparently overextended himself in a land speculation venture to the west, and found the Caldwell market less hospitable than he had hoped, a departure that was not directly connected to Elsie and Alfred, but which felt, Elsie thought privately, like a kind of settling of accounts. In the summer of 1882, Alfred expanded the ranch significantly, purchasing 2 adjacent parcels that brought the total acreage to just under 3,000 acres, a scale that made it one of the larger operations in the county, and which required additional hands, an additional foreman, and an expanded set of logistical challenges that Elsie found herself increasingly involved in solving. She had begun, by this point, to manage the ranch accounts formally, taking over from the system Alfred had run himself with meticulous but time-consuming care, and had implemented a set of record-keeping practices drawn from her boarding house experience that reduced the time required and improved the accuracy, which Alfred accepted with the undefended gratitude of a man who had known the books were not his strength. Alfred purchased the second ranch addition with a dual purpose. The expanded grazing land was needed for the growing herd, and the small additional house on the southern parcel became available as a separate dwelling for the ranch foreman, a quiet and capable man named Torres who had worked for Alfred since 1878, and whose wife and children, who had been living in Texas, were now able to come north. A development that pleased Elsie enormously, and that added to the ranch's small community the particular warmth of children running between the buildings in the evenings. Robert had his second birthday in February of 1883, and was by then a person of strong opinions and considerable physical energy, who had learned to walk at 10 months and had been moving at maximum speed ever since, in the direction of whatever interested him, which was, in equal proportions, the horses, the kitchen, the books on the parlor shelf, and the ranch dogs, a trio of border collies named, by Alfred with characteristic undemonstrativeness, 1, 2, and 3. Robert called them all dog with the democratic simplicity of a child who found specificity inefficient. In the spring of 1883, Elsie discovered she was pregnant again. This time she told Alfred in the morning before breakfast, when the early April light was just beginning through the bedroom window, lying beside him with her head on his chest and his arm around her, and the whole weight of the morning held in that moment of stillness before the day's requirements arrived. Again, he said, with a warmth in his voice that she recognized as his version of delight. The mathematics would seem to support it, she said. He pressed his lips to the top of her head, and she felt him smile against her hair, and they lay there in the early light while Robert performed his morning communications from the next room with the full volume of a child who saw no reason why the world should be sleeping while he was awake. The second child was a girl, born in October of 1883, dark-haired like her father and blue-eyed in a way that surprised everyone since neither parent had blue eyes, and then surprised no one once Mrs. Hartley noted that Elsie's mother had had blue eyes, which was the way of things, she said, children bringing forward the people who came before them. They named her Frances. Frances Margaret Crawford, Margaret for no one specifically, but because it was a name with presence, and Frances because Elsie had always loved the name, and because it had a kind of quiet dignity to it that felt right for a girl who arrived in the world with the precise gravity of a person who intended to observe everything carefully before committing to an opinion. The autumn of 1883 was one of the finest Elsie could remember. The ranch was doing well, the boarding house was full, the children were healthy, and Alfred had a particular quality of settled happiness about him that she had noticed beginning in 1880 and had deepened year by year in the way that good things deepen when they are tended properly. He was still the same careful, steady, attentive man she had first seen at the back of that council room, but his stillness had acquired a warmth that was different from the contained quality of their early acquaintance, as if the same fundamental nature had been given permission to open toward the light. She told him one evening, the October evening after Francis had been born and Robert was in bed, and the house was quiet in the particular way that houses are quiet when all their inhabitants are accounted for and safe. Sitting beside him in the parlor with the lamp burning between them and his book open in his lap and her sewing in her hands, she told him that she was happy. He looked up from his book, and his face in the lamplight held all of it, everything they had made together, the boarding house and the ranch and the two children asleep in the next rooms and the years of stubborn, necessary, unglamorous love, and he said, "So am I." Simply, without elaboration, in the tone of a man who knows that some sentences do not need additions. She set down her sewing and reached across and took his hand, and he closed his fingers around hers, and they sat like that in the lamplight while the Kansas autumn pressed against the windows, and the dogs settled on the porch, and the entire weight of the life they had built together rested around them, solid as the walls of the house, real as the legal deed in the land office with her name on it, warm as the sleeping breath of two children in the next room. The years continued to be good ones. In 1885, the boarding house was expanded, a wing added that brought the total room count to 10, financed by the accumulated profits of the operation, and requiring no loan from Beaumont's bank, a detail that Elsie noted with a private satisfaction that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with the clean particular pleasure of a thing accomplished entirely on her own terms. The expansion made the Sawyer boarding house the largest and most reputable lodging establishment in Caldwell, a reputation that had built itself on straightforward merits over 6 years of consistently clean rooms and decent meals, and a proprietress whose standards were clear and whose word was reliable. Clara Whitfield had, by 1885, been offered a half interest in the business, which she had accepted, and the two women ran it together in a partnership that was equal in fact if not always described as such by the men who did business with them, a circumstance they both found mildly amusing and professionally irrelevant. Alfred's ranch weathered the difficult winters of 1885 and 1886, when a series of severe blizzards swept the southern Kansas plains with a ferocity that broke several smaller operations and forced larger ones to make difficult decisions. The Crawford ranch lost cattle, an unavoidable reality, but not at the catastrophic rate of some of its neighbors, partly because Alfred had expanded his hay reserves the previous summer based on a reading of weather patterns that Elsie had also independently noticed and mentioned in passing, and partly because the ranch's infrastructure, built over 13 years of careful investment, was simply more resilient than younger operations. They helped where they could. The Torres family, whose small additional house on the southern parcel had become a genuine center of the ranch's social life, lost 2 horses in the February blizzard of 1886, and Alfred replaced them without discussion or accounting. 3 neighboring ranchers borrowed hay from the Crawford stores and repaid it when the spring came, and 2 did not, and Alfred made no accounting of either. "You will not make them feel the debt," Elsie observed one evening. "The debt is not the point," he said. "They survived the winter, that is the point." She loved him for that specifically. Not for the generosity alone, which was characteristic of him, but for the understanding behind it, that some things are given not as investment but as recognition of common humanity, and that in a country this harsh and this indifferent, people needed to recognize their common humanity more often, not less. In 1887, they had a 3rd child, another boy, who arrived in June and was named William James Crawford, James for Elsie's father, whose clear and careful handwriting she had inherited along with his habits of thought and his love of books, and who she missed with a renewed sharpness in the presence of this new person who carried his name. William was fair-haired, with a coloring that seemed to have skipped a generation, and he had Alfred's hazel eyes in a face that resembled neither parent directly, but managed to suggest both at once. Robert was 6 years old when William was born and had developed, by this point, the characteristic habits of a firstborn child raised between a practical, literary mother and a precise, observant father. He was thoughtful, occasionally stubborn, deeply interested in how things worked, and already showing the aptitude for numbers that Elsie recognized as her father's legacy moving forward through time. Frances was 3, and had come into her opinions with the unhurried certainty of a person who has always known what she thought and simply waited for the appropriate moment to say it. The family that filled the ranch house in the summer of 1887 was different in its density and warmth from the house Alfred had first carried her into as his wife in February of 1880. The walls held more now, the marks of children growing, the accumulation of shared years, the particular texture of a life made between two people who had both learned to be alone and had chosen something better. The boarding house continued through the 1880s and into the 1890s as Caldwell evolved. The great cattle drives gradually diminished as the western range was settled and fenced, and the railroad access points multiplied, reducing the necessity of the long trail north. The cattle economy of Kansas shifted, became more locally based, more agricultural in its surrounding context, and the town of Caldwell adjusted with the pragmatic resilience of a place that had survived the boom and was prepared to outlast it. Elsie adjusted her boarding house in response, moving its emphasis from the trail season cattle trade toward the more consistent business of traveling merchants, railroad representatives, land agents, and the various officials and professionals whose movement through the territory generated a steady if less dramatic demand for clean rooms and dependable meals. It was less exciting business than the cattle season had been, but it was more reliable, and reliability, she had long since decided, was underrated. In 1890, she added a small reading room to the boarding house, stocked with newspapers from Wichita, Topeka, and Kansas City, and a small collection of books selected with the same care she brought to everything, which became one of the establishment's distinguishing features, and which attracted, over the years, a particular kind of traveler who appreciated a place where intelligent thought was considered compatible with commercial enterprise. Alfred's ranch continued to grow and stabilize. By 1890, the Crawford Range was nearly 4,000 acres. The herd size had been rationalized from the peak cattle drive years to a more sustainable level consistent with the changing market, and the operation had a coherence and durability to it that reflected 20 years of accumulated judgment. He was known in the county as a fair dealer and an honest man, which were, Elsie had observed, the two most useful reputations available in a country where contracts were sometimes enforced by men rather than courts. Robert, who was 9 in 1890, had decided to be a rancher. This was not a surprise to anyone. He had been following Alfred on his rounds since he could keep pace, absorbing the vocabulary of land and cattle, and whether with the seriousness of a child who intends to use it. Alfred taught him what he asked to know, and the thing between them, the quiet, steady inheritance of a father's knowledge and a son's attention, was one of the more beautiful things Elsie had witnessed in her years at the ranch. Frances, at 7, had decided to be a doctor, a decision she made and communicated with the matter-of-fact authority of a person, announcing an established fact rather than an ambition. Elsie received this news with the same careful seriousness she had always tried to give to what her children felt and wanted, and Alfred, when told, said, "Then she will need to do very well in her studies," and left it at that, which was the precisely correct response. William at 3 was not yet deciding anything but had strong opinions about horses and dogs and the kitchen, in that order. It was in 1891, 11 years after their marriage, that Elsie finally wrote down the story of her first years in Caldwell. Not for publication, not for anyone else's reading, but for herself, because she had been, in those years, the keeper of her own testimony, and she wanted the testimony to exist somewhere outside her memory. She wrote it in one of the leather-bound notebooks she used for accounts, in her schoolteacher's hand, clear and even and precise. She wrote about the saloon, the words through the gap in the batwing door, the sound of laughter, and then the silence, and then the voice she did not know saying her name as though it was worth saying. She wrote about standing on the boardwalk with her hand flat on the wall, feeling something in herself that had been clenched for years begin to loosen. She wrote about the man she had not yet met, who had stood up for her name in that room before she even knew he existed, and what it had meant to her, not just the act itself but the quality of it, the fact that it had been done without expectation, without the apparatus of transaction or reward, simply because it was the right thing to do and he had been in a position to do it. She wrote, "I had been spoken for and spoken over and spoken around, and I had learned to walk away from the rooms where it happened because fighting the words only gave them more air." But Alfred Crawford, who did not know me, stood in a room full of men who were laughing and said that what was being said was a lie, and said my name as something attached to legitimate property and legitimate standing in this town, and the world shifted slightly, the way it does when something you had stopped believing possible turns out to be real after all. She wrote, "I did not know then what he would be to me. I knew only that no one had done that before. Not in Ohio, not in Missouri, not in Abilene or Wichita. Nobody had stood up for her name in any town until the Cattleman did it before she even knew." She closed the notebook and sat at the kitchen table of the ranch house in the autumn afternoon, listening to the sounds of her children in the yard, the particular sharp autumn quality of their voices carrying in the cold air, and Alfred's footsteps crossing the porch, his boots on the wood, the door opening. He came in and stopped when he saw her, reading her face the way he always read her face, which was to say carefully and without assumption. "Are you all right?" he asked. "More than all right," she said. "I was writing something. Good writing or difficult writing. Both," she said. "The good kind of difficult." He put the kettle on the stove and sat down across from her, and the afternoon settled around them, full of warmth and the smell of wood smoke and distant cattle and the permanent, particular smell of a house that is fully inhabited, and she looked at him across the table, this man who had been the turning point of her life, and felt the simple, enormous fact of it. 11 years. A boarding house on Kisham Street that she owned outright. A ranch of 4,000 acres with his name, and increasingly hers in the operation of it. 3 children who were each becoming more entirely themselves with every passing year. A life that had been built item by item, decision by decision, out of 2 people who had each learned to be alone and who had in a dry goods store in Caldwell, Kansas in the summer of 1879 begun the slow, remarkable process of learning something better. "Alfred," she said. "Elsie," he said, and the way he said it after 11 years still carried the same specific attention, as though her name in his mouth had never become habitual. "I love you," she said. Plain and direct, in the manner she had learned was the only way to say the things that mattered. "I know," he said. "I love you too." And then he smiled, that private smile that had been hers since November of 1879, that she had never seen him give to anyone else. That was his version of the full, unguarded opening of himself. Every single day, without reservation. The kettle began to steam, and the children's voices came through the window, Robert calling Francis's name with the particular urgency of a 9-year-old who has discovered something interesting. Francis's answering voice carrying its customary combination of skepticism and curiosity, and somewhere in the yard William's laughter, high and clear as a bell in the cold air. And Elsie Ruth Crawford, who had come to Caldwell with $230 and a deed, and a plan that was either practical or desperate depending on how you looked at it, sat in the warm kitchen of the life she had made and knew, with the completeness of a woman who has finished a very long journey and recognized the destination, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The boarding house would stand for another 30 years on Kisham Street, and travelers stopping in Caldwell into the new century would be told to stay at the Sawyer house if they wanted clean sheets and good food and the reading room, the best reading room between Wichita and the Texas border. Clara Whitfield would eventually purchase the remaining interest from Elsie and run it alone with equal success, and the two women would remain friends for the rest of their long lives. Robert Crawford would take over the management of the Crawford Range in 1910, by which point it had grown under Alfred's careful stewardship to a substantial and genuinely prosperous operation, and he would run it with the same combination of his father's precision and his mother's analytical clarity that made it one of the most successful ranches in southern Kansas. Frances Crawford would, after considerable education and determined navigation of every obstacle placed in her path by a medical establishment that was not yet ready for her but would eventually have to accept the reality of her, become a physician in Wichita in 1905, one of the first women to practice medicine in the territory, which surprised no one who had known her at 7 years old, announcing it as established fact. William would become a lawyer, which surprised everyone and on reflection surprised no one. Alfred Crawford lived to be 78 years old, longer than most men in his country and time, and the quality of him did not diminish with age but deepened, the way good timber deepens, the grain becoming more visible, the substance more apparent. He died in 1921 in the ranch house in the autumn, with Elsie beside him and their children gathered, and the dogs on the porch, and the Kansas prairie outside the window still rolling to every horizon in the way it always had, indifferent and magnificent and permanent. And Elsie, who had learned from a long life that the measurement of things was not in their duration, but in their quality, in the specific irreplaceable nature of what they had been, sat beside him and held his hand and was grateful, with her whole self, for every single day of it. She had come to Caldwell alone, and she had built something there, something real and lasting and entirely her own, the boarding house and the reputation and the legal standing and the life. And she had met, in the process of building it, a man who had stood up in a room full of laughing men, and said her name as though it was worth saying before she even knew he existed, and she had loved him well and been well loved in return for 41 years, and she believed, from the specific evidence of her specific life, that this was one of the great and underrated accomplishments available to a person, to be loved well and to love well back, for a long time, without diminishment. She kept the leather notebook with the story in it in the drawer of her writing table, and after she was gone, it passed to Frances, and then to Frances's daughter, and then to daughters after that, and the story of Elsie Ruth Sawyer and the cattleman who said her name before she knew him traveled forward through the family like the blue eyes that skipped a generation, surfacing in unexpected faces in unexpected years, a piece of old light that did not go out.